There comes a time when the noise of the outside world no longer fills the emptiness you've been carrying inside. It's not something you announce. It's not something that happens in a dramatic epiphany or during a storm of tears. No, it's quieter than that. It's subtle, like waking up one morning and realizing the mask you've been wearing doesn't fit anymore. The script you've been following feels foreign in your mouth. You don't even know when it started to fall apart. You just know that something inside you is tired of pretending, and whatever comes next has to be real. You begin to notice how much of your life has been shaped by survival rather than intention. The way you people please to avoid conflict, the way you overextended to feel valued, the way you dimmed your joy, your creativity, your essence to avoid standing out. At the time, it felt like necessary armor, a means of getting through. But now that same armor feels suffocating, heavy. You're not angry at the version of yourself who wore it. You're grateful. They kept you alive. But you know now that you're ready for more than just surviving. You're ready to live. And living doesn't begin with a grand gesture. It begins with a whisper that says, you don't have to keep carrying this. A whisper that arrives when you're folding laundry or brushing your teeth or staring at your ceiling late at night, wondering if you're the only one who feels like something important is missing. You're not. There are millions of people walking around with quiet grief in their chest. You begin to realize that most people aren't looking for answers. They're looking for permission to rest, permission to let go, permission to be human. And so you begin to give that to yourself. You start asking different questions. Instead of, how can I be better? You ask, what do I really want? Instead of, why am I not like them? You ask, who am I underneath all this noise? Instead of measuring your worth by how much you achieve, you begin to measure it by how gently you treat yourself on the days you feel unworthy. This is a shift not many will see from the outside, but you feel it. And that feeling, it begins to move mountains inside of you. You stop craving constant productivity. You stop using busyness as a badge of honor. You notice how often you were moving not out of passion, but out of pressure. How often you filled your time to avoid facing yourself. Now you let the stillness stretch. At first it's uncomfortable. The silence is deafening. But soon you begin to hear things you never made space for before. The sound of your own breath, the beat of your heart, the ache that's been sitting in your chest, waiting for acknowledgement. You begin to sit with that ache, not as a problem to be solved, but as a guest to be welcomed. You begin to treat yourself like someone you love. It sounds simple, but for years you've loved others more fully than you ever loved yourself. You showed up for their needs while silencing your own. You forgave them for things you still hold against yourself. Now you start turning that same grace inward. You rest when you're tired. You say no when you mean it. You feed yourself nourishing food, not as punishment or reward, but as care. You stop making self-love a destination and start making it a daily choice. You realize how much of your pain came from trying to be everything to everyone. How you twisted yourself into shapes you didn't recognize just to avoid rejection. But rejection is no longer your greatest fear. Abandoning yourself is. So you choose differently now. You speak even when your voice shakes. You walk away even when you still love them. You disappoint others rather than betraying your own soul. And though it's hard, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Alignment. And that alignment, that inner congruence, becomes your North Star. You stop chasing clarity. You don't need every answer before you move. You don't need to have it all figured out before you begin. You start trusting that clarity will come through the doing, that the path will reveal itself as you walk it. And when it doesn't, you pause, not out of fear, but out of reverence. You wait for the next right step. You stop forcing what no longer flows. You trust the timing that lives in your bones, even when the world says to hurry. You begin to see your pain not as something to hide, but as something to honor. You stop masking it with smiles. You stop numbing it with distractions. You sit with it. You cry without apologizing. You grieve without rushing. And in doing so, you learn that pain is not your enemy. It's your teacher. It's the part of you that still believes you're worthy of healing. And when you treat it with compassion rather than contempt, something inside of you softens. The sharp edges begin to smooth. The sorrow begins to speak. And you, for the first time, begin to listen. You understand now that you don't need to be constantly evolving to be valuable. You're not a self-improvement project. You're a human being. You don't need to optimize every hour of your day to feel worthy. You don't need to turn every hobby into a hustle. You can just be. You can rest. You can exist without explanation. And that too is sacred. That too is enough. You begin to question the narratives you've inherited, the beliefs passed down through generations or etched into your psyche by a culture obsessed with perfection. You ask, who told me I wasn't enough? Where did I learn that love must be earned? Why do I fear being seen for who I really am? And as you trace those threads, you begin to unravel them, gently, patiently, not to blame, but to reclaim. And in that reclamation, you find freedom. You stop comparing your journey to others. You stop using someone else's timeline as a measure of your own success. You understand now that everyone is running a different race, that life is not linear and healing is not a checklist. You celebrate your slow progress. You honor your unique rhythm. You trust that what's meant for you will not pass you by, and that you don't need to compete to receive it. Your energy shifts from scarcity to abundance, from fear to faith, from striving to surrender. And slowly, gently, you begin to believe again. Not in a perfect life, but in a real one. One where you can be flawed and still worthy. One where you can have bad days and still be healing. One where joy is not a prize you earn, but a right you reclaim. You believe in your own becoming even when it's messy, especially then, because the mess is sacred too. There's a kind of transformation that doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't need to be witnessed by the world or validated by accolades. It happens slowly, beneath the surface, in the places no one else can see. It begins when you stop trying to outrun your past and start walking alongside it. When you stop pretending the wounds don't still ache and begin to treat them like living parts of your story. Raw, yes, but also honest. That's the beginning of real change. When you realize you don't have to fix everything to be whole, you only have to stop running. And so you do. You stop, you sit, you listen. Not just to the outside world, but to the voice you've been ignoring for years. The one that doesn't speak in urgency or noise, but in whispers and nudges. It tells you things that are both terrifying and liberating. Things like, you're allowed to say no, or you don't have to keep proving yourself, or even, you were never broken, just unheard. That voice, the quiet, steady one you pushed aside for so long, it becomes your compass. You don't always know where it's leading, but you know it's real, and you follow it one step at a time. You begin to redefine what it means to be strong, not as the ability to carry the heaviest burdens without complaint, but the courage to put them down when they become too much. Not as the refusal to cry, but the willingness to fall apart and trust you'll find your way back. You no longer idolize endurance. You don't need to be the one who never breaks. You want to be the one who breaks open and grows from it. The one who feels everything deeply and still chooses love. The one who doesn't armor up, but lays the armor down and says, I'm here, I'm real, and that's enough. You begin to look at your reflection differently, not with criticism, but with curiosity. You no longer focus on what needs to be changed, but on what needs to be loved. You see the lines on your face not as flaws, but as maps of where you've been. You see the softness in your belly not as failure, but as evidence of living. You stop asking your body to shrink in order to be accepted. You start asking it what it needs to feel safe, to feel alive, to feel held. And then you listen. You notice how often your mind pulls you into the past or flings you into the future. You see how easily your peace gets stolen by things that are no longer happening or haven't yet come. So you practice returning, not perfectly, not once and for all, but breath by breath, moment by moment. You learn how to anchor yourself in the now, in the way your fingers curl around a warm mug, in the sound of your breath entering your chest, in the rhythm of your footsteps on the floor. Presence stops being a concept and becomes a refuge, a home you return to again and again. You begin to take up space, not by shouting, not by dominating, but by simply being. You no longer shrink to make others more comfortable. You stop dimming your joy so others don't feel threatened. You let yourself be fully seen, fully expressed, fully alive. And yes, it's scary. Vulnerability always is. But it's also sacred, because the moment you stop hiding, you give others permission to do the same. And in that space, real connection is born. You start to see self-love not as a luxury, but as a necessity. It's not bubble baths and affirmations, though those things matter too. It's the quiet decision to show up for yourself when it would be easier to abandon yourself. It's the choice to tell the truth even when your voice shakes. It's how you treat yourself in the dark moments, when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when everything feels uncertain. Self-love is staying with yourself when the world doesn't, staying with yourself when even your own thoughts try to convince you you're unworthy. You stay, and in that staying you bloom. You notice how healing changes your relationships, not because other people change, but because you begin to meet them from a different place. You stop tolerating behavior that dishonors your soul. You stop trying to fix people who don't want to grow. You don't do it with cruelty. You do it with clarity, with grace. You love people enough to let them be who they are, and you love yourself enough to walk away when who they are hurts your peace. You stop trying to change people into who you need them to be. You start becoming the person you needed, and choosing others who meet you there. You begin to feel joy in unexpected places, not the kind of joy that shouts and dances in the spotlight, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up when you're washing dishes and a memory makes you smile, the kind that bubbles up when you're sitting alone and realize you're not lonely, the kind that touches your heart when you hear the wind rustle through trees and remember how small and sacred everything is. Joy becomes less about intensity and more about presence, less about escape and more about return. You stop seeing emotions as problems to solve. You learn how to feel without fixing, how to grieve without rushing, how to be angry without turning it inward. You stop labeling certain emotions as bad. You begin to see them all as sacred, as necessary, as teachers. You allow yourself the full spectrum of being human. You don't shame yourself for the days you feel heavy. You don't force yourself to smile through sadness. You let it pass through like a wave, and then you rise, not because the pain is gone, but because you've learned how to carry it differently. You find that silence no longer scares you. You don't need to fill every pause with noise. You don't need background sound to distract from your thoughts. You sit in the stillness, and instead of drowning in it, you begin to float. You listen to the quiet. You hear your own breath, your own heartbeat. You remember that you are alive, even in the stillness, especially in the stillness. The silence becomes a sanctuary, a place where the world falls away and your soul has space to speak. You stop confusing productivity with worthiness. You realize how often you've tied your value to how much you could get done, how much you could offer, how much you could give. But you are not a machine. You are a human. And your value isn't found in output, it's found in your being. You start to measure your day not by how busy you were, but by how present you were, how kind, how real. You no longer punish yourself for needing rest. You offer it like a gift, because now you know. You don't have to burn out to be enough. You notice how your relationship with time begins to change. You don't feel like you're running out of it anymore. You don't feel behind. You stop racing through your days trying to catch up with some imagined version of success. You slow down. You take walks without a destination. You sip your tea slowly. You let conversations breathe. And somehow in that slowing, life begins to expand. You experience more, not because you're doing more, but because you're finally here for it. You stop needing life to be perfect, to be beautiful. You don't need all the answers. You don't need everything to be okay. You learn how to hold the paradox, the joy and the pain, the peace and the grief, the hope and the doubt. You become someone who doesn't need resolution to feel peace. You become someone who can hold tension without collapsing. And that, you realize, is the truest strength. And maybe for the first time, you stop waiting to be chosen. You choose yourself, not because no one else will, but because it no longer matters if they do. You don't need to be someone's first choice to know you're worthy. You don't need to be praised to feel valuable. You don't need to be loved perfectly to believe you deserve love. You choose yourself in the silence, in the confusion, in the waiting. You choose yourself when it's hard, when it's scary, when it feels unfamiliar. You keep choosing, and that choice becomes the foundation of everything else. There is a shift that begins, not with thunder, but with stillness. A shift where you stop asking the world to give you peace and begin creating it within yourself. You realize how often you waited for validation, for love, for permission. How often you believed that something outside of you needed to change for you to feel whole. And then one day, without ceremony, you realize that peace isn't given. It's reclaimed, not in grand acts, but in the subtle refusal to abandon yourself in moments of doubt. You choose to stay with yourself no matter what. And that decision, soft, steady, unspoken, becomes your quiet revolution. You begin to rewrite the way you move through your days. You no longer wake up and dive into urgency. You let the morning greet you. You sit with your thoughts not to fix them, but to witness them. You breathe more slowly. You eat without rushing. You walk without hurrying toward a destination. These aren't changes the world will notice, but you will. Because in those moments, you are no longer surviving your day. You are living it fully, presently, with a kind of sacred awareness that can't be taught, only remembered. You start catching yourself in old patterns. The way you tense when someone is upset with you, the way you soften your truth to avoid discomfort, the way you smile when you really want to cry. But instead of shaming yourself, you get curious. You ask, where did I learn this? What part of me still thinks I'm unsafe when I'm honest? And you don't rush to change the behavior. You sit with it. You thank it for how it once protected you. And then gently you offer it another way. A way that doesn't require you to disappear. A way that lets you exist fully. You stop waiting for someone else to show up for you in the ways you need. You stop hoping that someone will finally see the real you and love you just as you are. You begin to offer those things to yourself. You see your needs not as inconveniences, but as sacred invitations. You create space for your emotions instead of suppressing them. You speak up for yourself, not to be loud, but to be heard. And as you begin showing up for yourself consistently, something shifts. You realize you're not alone. Not because someone else finally stayed, but because you did. You find that your healing begins to stretch beyond you. The more you soften with yourself, the softer you become with others. The more you understand your own patterns, the more you understand theirs. You don't excuse bad behavior, but you hold compassion for where it comes from. You stop reacting and start responding. You no longer feel the need to control every interaction. You let people be who they are, and you decide who you'll be in response. You stop trying to be right. You start choosing to be kind. And in that kindness, not everyone stays, but those who do are the ones who matter. You begin to feel grief not as a thing to overcome, but as a companion on the journey. It visits you in unexpected moments, a smell, a song, a season, and instead of resisting, you welcome it. You make space for the ache. You let the tears come. You don't try to rush through it. You let grief speak its language, and it does, quietly, softly. It says you cared. It says you loved. It says you lived. And in that reminder, grief no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like evidence that your heart is still open. You stop seeking perfection. You start seeking truth. You allow yourself to be messy, in progress, human. You don't need to look polished to feel proud. You don't need to have it all together to feel worthy. You drop the performance. You choose presence instead. You find beauty in the undone. In the process, in the parts of you that are still figuring it out. And you realize that authenticity is far more magnetic than perfection ever was. You don't need to impress. You just need to be. You begin to release the shame you've carried for so long. The shame of not being enough. The shame of wanting more. The shame of failing. The shame of feeling too deeply. You begin to see shame not as truth, but as a shadow. And like all shadows, it loses power when you bring it into the light. You speak it aloud. You name it. You offer it compassion. And in doing so, you take your power back. Not through denial, but through radical acceptance. Through choosing to love yourself in the places you once tried to hide. You notice how your relationship with time changes when you stop trying to rush your growth. You begin to honor your own pace. You don't feel behind anymore. You realize there is no catching up in life. There's only unfolding, only deepening, only becoming. And becoming can't be forced. It happens when you're ready, when you're rooted, when you've learned to stay with yourself long enough to witness your own blooming. You find that your idea of love changes too. You no longer chase love that makes you anxious. You no longer stay where you have to earn affection. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You want calm. You want safety. You want to be seen in your wholeness, not for your potential, not for what you can give, but for who you are now. And because you want that, you begin to give that. To yourself, to others. You love more honestly. You love without possession. You love without disappearing. And in that kind of love, something sacred unfolds. You stop apologizing for your needs. You don't feel guilty for resting. You don't shrink your dreams to make others comfortable. You stop seeking permission to exist fully. You own your space. You own your voice. You own your life. Not in arrogance, but in reverence. You see now that your existence is not a mistake. Your desires are not an accident. Your dreams are not foolish. They are echoes of something deeper calling you home. And maybe for the first time, you look in the mirror and see someone worth staying for. Someone brave enough to keep going. Someone soft enough to still believe in love. Someone strong enough to rest. Someone wise enough to choose peace. You see not the brokenness, but the becoming. Not the flaws, but the fire. Not the wounds, but the wisdom. And you smile not because everything is perfect, but because you've learned how to love yourself even when it's not. There is something incredibly freeing about realizing that you no longer need to seek external permission to evolve. You stop asking the world to tell you who you are allowed to be. You don't wait for validation before changing course. You simply listen. to the quiet pull within, to the discomfort that has overstayed its welcome, to the whisper in your chest that says, it's time now, and you follow it. Not because the path ahead is certain, but because the path behind you is no longer where you belong. That is the quiet beginning of self-trust, the kind that builds without applause, the kind that no one sees but changes everything. You begin to feel the weight of the old expectations falling away, not in a dramatic crash, but in a series of soft, conscious choices. The expectation to be liked by everyone no longer sits heavily on your shoulders. The expectation to be agreeable, to always smile, to always perform grace even when you're aching, begins to dissolve. You feel it in the moments you say no without explanation, in the times you stop over-apologizing for your presence, in the days you choose your mental peace over the approval of others. And with each decision, you reclaim your time, your energy, your life. You stop negotiating your worth. You no longer argue with people who refuse to see you clearly. You realize that defending yourself to someone who has already decided who you are is a form of self-abandonment. And you are done abandoning yourself. You do not owe your softness to those who treat it like weakness. You do not owe your truth to those who weaponize it. You do not owe your energy to those who only know how to take. Instead, you begin to pour into spaces that feel like safety, not performance. You give to people who meet you, not mold you. And in that sacred discernment, you begin to bloom. You learn to grieve not only what you lost, but also what you never received. The words you longed to hear and never did. The moments of care that never arrived. The safety you craved that always felt just out of reach. You no longer minimize your longing or shame your sadness. You let it surface. You feel it without turning away. And you begin to create space in your life to give yourself what you once needed from others. You speak gently to your inner child. You hold space for your unmet needs. You stop waiting for someone else to heal what you now have the power to tend. You start living less from shoulds and more from truth. You feel it in your bones when something is misaligned, even if it makes sense on paper. You stop betraying your intuition just to check the next box. You walk away from paths that feel tight around your spirit. You say yes only when your whole body agrees. And even when you don't yet have a clear plan, you trust that clarity will come. Not through thinking harder, but through choosing truth. Your compass becomes, does this feel honest? And slowly, you build a life from that place. You become less interested in outcomes and more interested in integrity. You stop doing things just to get a result. You start asking, is this who I want to be while I do it? You care more about how you show up than what you achieve. You measure success not in accolades, but in peace, in how well you slept last night, in how much your inner voice sounds like kindness, in whether or not you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I honored myself today. That becomes enough, more than enough. You learn that boundaries are not walls, they're invitations. They invite others to meet you with the same care you offer yourself. You stop over-explaining why you need space. You stop softening your no to make it easier for others to swallow. You trust that your needs are valid even when others don't understand them. And the people who respect your boundaries become sacred mirrors, reminding you that love doesn't control, it honors. It doesn't test, it trusts. It doesn't demand access, it earns presence. You give yourself that kind of love first, and then you begin to recognize it more easily in others. You begin to accept that some people will never understand the path you're on. Some will misinterpret your silence, your distance, your change. And that's okay. You no longer shape your life around being understood. You stop explaining your choices to people who don't live your truth. You don't shrink your dreams into digestible parts so others feel comfortable. You simply live, fully, honestly. And the people who are meant to walk with you, they will not need an explanation. They will simply say, I see you, and you'll know they do. You stop seeking closure from the ones who hurt you. You understand now that closure is an inside job. You no longer need them to say sorry. You no longer need the conversation where everything is unpacked and understood. You let the silence be the closure. You let the lack of effort be the answer. And in that letting go, you find peace. Not because the story ended how you wanted, but because you finally stopped rereading the same chapter. You close the book, not in anger, but in acceptance. You are free, and that freedom tastes better than any apology ever could. You begin to celebrate progress that isn't visible, the days you choose not to spiral, the moments you breathe instead of react, the nights you put your phone away and choose rest, the times you catch yourself before you fall into an old pattern and gently redirect. You no longer wait for someone else to validate your healing. You see it in the mirror. You feel it in your nervous system. You track it in the way your body softens, in the way your heart stays open. In that kind of progress, it matters most. You embrace solitude not as loneliness, but as a sacred reunion. Time alone stops feeling like punishment. It becomes a gift, a space where you reconnect with your voice, where you hear your own heartbeat, where you stop reaching and start receiving. You no longer need constant conversation to feel seen. You no longer need someone beside you to feel whole. You sit in silence and it holds you, not as emptiness, but as presence, not as isolation, but as intimacy. You are never more fully yourself than when you are alone with your truth. And you've come to love that version of you the most. You start to believe that you don't have to earn your way into a life that feels good. That joy doesn't have to be deserved. That love isn't a prize. You release the old belief that suffering is your destiny. You allow light in, not because everything is fixed, but because you're ready. You say yes to peace even when chaos knocks. You say yes to softness even when you're scared. You say yes to the life that's calling, not the one that looks impressive, but the one that feels like home. And for the first time, maybe ever, you don't just survive the day, you live it. Not perfectly, not without bumps, but honestly, presently, in alignment with the version of you that no longer hides, no longer performs, no longer pretends. You live it in your own name, and it's enough. It's finally, deeply, truly enough. There's a kind of power that doesn't come with dominance or assertion. It isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It's the quiet power of someone who no longer needs the world's permission to exist. The kind of power that comes from inner clarity, from knowing what you need, what you value, and what you are no longer available for. You don't have to push to prove anything. You don't have to perform. You simply are. And in that simple being, you radiate a calm that cannot be faked, a steadiness that comes not from having it all figured out, but from knowing who you no longer want to be. You begin to value peace over being right. You stop trying to convince people to see your perspective. You realize that your energy is too sacred to waste on debates that only lead to disconnection. You no longer enter conversations to win. You enter them to understand, or you don't enter them at all. You choose your peace more often, not out of avoidance, but out of wisdom. You know now that being understood by everyone is not a requirement for being whole. You understand yourself. You've learned to sit with your own questions, and that's enough. You notice how much your heart softens when you allow yourself to rest, not just physically, but emotionally. You stop forcing yourself to be okay when you're not. You stop turning healing into another project. You let yourself unravel when you need to. You take the pressure off of always being strong. You let the tears come without needing to explain them. You stop rushing the process. You treat your emotions not as obstacles, but as honored guests. And in doing so, your heart opens, wider than it ever has, because it finally feels safe to be held by you. and a love that doesn't ask you to perform. You let joy find you in the strangest places, in the way your cat stretches across the sunlit floor, in the scent of something baking in the oven, in the memory of a laugh you thought you'd forgotten. You don't ask it to last forever. You don't grip it. You simply let it move through you like a breeze. You say yes to it when it arrives, and you don't chase it when it leaves. Because you know now, joy is not something you force. It's something you allow. And the more you soften, the more it visits. You start letting people love you, not the performance of you, not the curated, filtered, convenient version. You let them love the you who gets overwhelmed in crowds, who sometimes needs to cancel plans, who is still learning how to trust. You stop hiding the parts of you that are still healing. You stop trying to be easier to love. You understand now that real love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires truth. And you in your fullness are already enough. You stop waiting for life to begin when things get better. You stop postponing joy until the pain is gone. You stop holding your breath until it all makes sense. You breathe now. You live now. You understand that the healing isn't in the destination. It's in the way you show up to your life today, with honesty, with care, with your heart wide open, even when it trembles. You don't have to force yourself to be optimistic. You just have to stop abandoning yourself in moments of fear. You just have to keep coming back to your breath, to your truth, to your body, to the knowing that you've made it through every hard thing so far. You are not broken. You are becoming. You are not behind. You are unfolding. And in this unfolding, you are learning how to live, not for anyone else, but for yourself. And maybe, for the first time in your life, you believe you deserve to. There's a quiet power in realizing that you don't have to be everything to everyone. You begin to release the weight of expectation, the unspoken contracts you signed to be the dependable one, the strong one, the understanding one, the one who always shows up even when your own cup is empty. Slowly you place those roles down, not with resentment, but with honesty. You admit that you're tired, that you have limits, that you too need to be held. And in that admission, something miraculous happens. You make space for your own humanity. You give yourself back to yourself. You begin to see that healing is not a straight line. It's a spiral. You revisit the same wounds from different angles. Some days you feel like you've moved mountains, and other days a small comment sends you spiraling back into doubt. But now, instead of calling it failure, you call it deepening. You understand that coming back to a wound doesn't mean you're back at the beginning. It means you're strong enough now to meet it with new awareness. You bring light into the places that once terrified you. And in that light, healing softens into something sustainable. You start speaking your needs without shrinking. You no longer preface your requests with apologies. You don't wait for someone to read your mind or prove that they're worthy of your truth. You just speak. You say what you feel, what you want, what you're afraid of. And the world doesn't end. The people who love you lean in, the ones who don't fall away. And either way, you remain rooted, because your self-expression is no longer about outcome. It's about alignment. You learn to rest before you're exhausted, to pause before you reach the edge, to listen to your body when it whispers, not just when it screams. You stop waiting for breakdowns to give yourself permission to step back. You no longer treat self-care like an emergency exit. It becomes a rhythm, a ritual, a way of honoring your life as it is now. You don't need to earn your rest. You don't need to justify it. You just need to receive it. And the more you do, the more your body begins to trust you again. You start finding freedom in the things you used to avoid. Silence no longer feels threatening. Alone time no longer feels like punishment. You stop needing constant stimulation to feel okay. You start hearing the hum of your own presence, the peace in your own breath, the clarity that emerges when there's no one else to impress. You discover that being alone with yourself is not empty, it's full of everything you've been too distracted to notice. You begin to enjoy your own company, not because you're isolating, but because you've finally made peace with your own presence. You begin to hold others with more compassion, not because you've forgotten how they hurt you, but because you see now that everyone is carrying something invisible. You stop taking things so personally. You understand that most people are acting from their own pain, their own fear, their own unhealed wounds. And while this doesn't excuse harm, you become more intentional with your words. You speak not to fill silence, but to create meaning. You say, "I love you," like it matters. "I'm sorry," like you mean it. "I understand," without needing to be right. You stop performing kindness. You embody it. And you offer your words like a gift, measured, mindful, meaningful. Not because you're afraid to speak, but because you know now that language has the power to heal or to harm. And you choose healing again and again. You stop needing your healing to look a certain way. You don't compare your journey to someone else's anymore. You understand that everyone's timeline is different, that what looks like progress for one person might not look like anything on the outside. But it matters that getting out of bed is a win, that asking for help is a win, that saying "I don't know" without shame is a win. You stop demanding your healing be linear. You let it be honest, messy, true. You start to see yourself as worthy, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you are when everything else is stripped away. When there are no accolades, no applause, no performance, just you, in your softness, your honesty, your unpolished truth. And that person is enough. That person is lovable. That person is sacred. You begin to feel your connection to others deepen. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're showing up more fully. You're no longer filtering yourself to be accepted. You're no longer trying to say the right thing to avoid rejection. You're just being. And in that being, you attract people who love you as you are. People who don't need you to shrink or twist or prove. People who meet you in the middle, with presence, with respect, with love that feels like home. You recognize how often you used to search for answers outside of yourself, in books, in mentors, in relationships. And while those things have their place, you've learned that the deepest answers are the ones you uncover within. The ones that come when you slow down. When you stop asking others for directions and start listening to the map inside your chest, you stop seeking gurus. You become your own guide. And in doing so, you begin to trust yourself in ways you never thought possible. You begin to practice gratitude, not as a bypass, but as a grounding. You don't use it to ignore your pain, but to hold it in balance. You learn to say, "This hurts and I'm still grateful. I'm confused and I trust something good is coming. I'm afraid and I'm choosing to stay open." Gratitude stops being a list you check off and starts being a lens you live through. A way of seeing the world that softens your edges and sharpens your vision. And through all of this, you begin to understand that healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been beneath the noise. It's about peeling back the layers of who the world told you to be and uncovering the truth that's always been waiting. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be whole. And wholeness doesn't come from doing more. It comes from being with what is, from saying, "Even this belongs," from meeting yourself right here, exactly as you are. There is something deeply honest about the way healing moves through you when you stop demanding it to arrive wrapped in certainty. You begin to learn that real transformation rarely comes as a sudden breakthrough. It's more like erosion, a slow, steady wearing down of all the false narratives that once clung to your skin. The ones that told you you weren't lovable until you were more successful. The ones that said you had to earn rest, apologize for your softness, or dim your truth in the name of politeness. You see now how many of those beliefs were inherited, not born from truth, but fear, not built from love, but survival, and gently you begin to put them down. You stop needing to know what's coming in order to feel safe. You begin to live inside the unknown, not as something to be feared, but as a space to be filled with presence. You stop planning every moment to avoid discomfort. You let yourself wake up and not have the whole day figured out. You trust that your intuition will guide you one moment at a time. You don't need to know the next 5 years. You just need to listen for the next right step. And when that step isn't clear, you rest. You don't force clarity. You let it unfold. You become more conscious of the way you spend your energy, not just your time, but your spirit. You begin to ask yourself questions before you commit. Does this drain me or nourish me? Is this obligation or alignment? Am I doing this out of love or fear? You no longer say yes when your soul is screaming no. You no longer pretend to be okay just to avoid discomfort. You choose presence over performance, truth over obligation. And in doing so, you begin to build a life that feels like home.